So today is the last message in the Foreshadows series, and it's titled Coming Out of the Shadows. And the subtitle is The Journey is Just as Important as the Destination. And this message is about awakening to see how our story, our journey of faith, is a vital contribution in the telling of God's story. Everyone loves a great story. Don't you love great stories? Think about the great story that you love. You know, we like to curl up on a couch with a good book or go to a theater and watch the latest blockbuster movie, or the Performing Arts Center enjoying our favorite Broadway musical, listening to a new song on our Bluetooth headphones, or sitting by the campfire spinning scary tales with good friends. And we love great stories that inspire us, that scare the you-know-what out of us, that make us laugh, that make us cry. And we love stories where people overcome incredible challenges. Movies like The Reverend, stories like The Grapes of Wrath. We love stories where good triumphs over evil, like Star Wars, The Hunger Games. And we love stories where the hero sacrifices his life to save others, like the Titanic in Braveheart. Everyone loves a good story, but have you ever wondered why we all love good stories? And have you ever wondered why the kind of stories that we love the most all seem to follow the same storyline over and over and over again? The characters and the situations may change from story to story, but the storyline never changes. Usually starts off by getting us emotionally connected to the main characters. Then, as the music turns darker, the evil villain comes on the scene to mess things up. That gives rise for the superhero of the story to defeat the evil villain and rescue the heroine. And then finally, that famous grab the Kleenex box scene where the hero and the heroine ride off into the sunset to live happily ever after. The end. Is it the end, though? Aren't we really left to imagine a new beginning where life will be perfect for them forever? And I believe that the reason why we're all suckers for these kinds of stories is because they are merely smaller versions of a bigger story. The big story that God wrote, the meta-narrative, the story above all the other smaller stories. You see, before the beginning of time, God wrote a beautiful love story. We're all the main characters of that love story. The evil villain has already come to mess things up, but our superhero, God himself, will one day defeat the evil villain once and for all, rescue us, his beloved, and then together we will ride off into the sunset to live happily ever after. The end? No. It's just a new beginning of a life that will be perfect forever. And whether we believe in God or not, authors and scriptwriters and songwriters and poets keep producing smaller narratives of God's meta-narrative time and time again, because we're all made in the image of God. It oozes out of them, and they can't help themselves. Genesis 1:27 says that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God's divine imprint is embedded into our DNA. And this is what separates us from all the other species on this planet. And for this reason, you can go anywhere in the world at any time during history, and you will find man worshiping something. It may be the sun, could be a pile of rocks, a dragon with 7 heads, or even fame and money. But we're all worshiping something. And we can say, I believe in this, or I believe in that, or I don't believe in anything. And the fact that we can believe in something or we can believe in nothing is what sets us apart from all the other species on this planet. And it's what causes us to think and to live differently from all those other species. My dog, Buddy, never comes up to me and says, "What's the meaning of life?" Or I feel unsatisfied with where I'm at right now. All Buddy really cares about is when do I eat and when do I poop. Only man asks deeper kinds of questions like, why am I here? What should I be doing with my life? And we do this because we're made in God's image. Ecclesiastes 3:11 adds something called eternity to our DNA mix. It says, God has set eternity in our hearts, yet we cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And the question to ask from this passage is, we can't fathom what God has done from the beginning and the end of what? And the answer is from the beginning to the end of God's story. His story. History, right? I love that little wordplay. His story. History. You see something God created called time? Are you all aware that we're stuck in time? You can't stop it, right? God created something called time. And it gives you and I, time is what gives you and I only a short role in this crazy story, because our time on earth is really short compared to the giant-sized length of this story. Time is what keeps us from seeing the whole story from beginning to end. But the author of the big story lives outside of time. God is not confined to time, which means that he can see every detail of the story at any point in the story that he chooses to look at. But even though we can't see the whole story from beginning to end, God made us in his image, and he put something in our hearts called eternity. And so we write stories, and we ask deep philosophical questions that all flow from the meta-narrative that's embedded in our DNA, because intuitively we know there's something more to life than meets the eye. We just know it. In addition, God has given us a sneak peek, a preview at the whole story, something called the Bible. The Bible is the spiritual reader's digest version of the big story. You know, some people view the Bible primarily as a book of inspirational stories and use it to find motivation they need to make it through each day. Others see the Bible primarily as a self-help book and use it to overcome personal struggles that they face in life. Still others see the Bible primarily as a theological roadmap and use it to understand who God is and what he wants from us. And the Bible is all of those things. But at its core, it is one seamless narrative from beginning to end. It is the story of God and the story of us. And to help us discover the deeper meaning and purpose of life, God tapped a very special group of people called the Jews to play the role of his biblical family in the big story. In this story, the Jewish people provide a beautiful prophetic roadmap of where God's story is headed. And as I have stated each week, Foreshadows unlocks the mystery of God's plan to build an eternal family. And there are many dimensions to God's story, but building a family of faith who will live with God forever is his primary goal for this story. A family of faith who will ride off into the sunset with their hero to live happily ever after. And by looking at the 7 foreshadows that make up biblical Israel, we're able to see the beauty and the brilliance of God's plan stretched out over those 3 episodes, over the entire course of history. God wrote this nail-biting trilogy that unfolds over the whole scope of history in 3 very suspenseful, nail-biting episodes. And the Foreshadows trilogy follows this 3-stage progressive nature of God described in Revelation 8 as the God who was in episode 1, the God who is in episode 2, and the God who is to come in episode 3. Collectively, these 7 foreshadows describe God's unconditional and everlasting relationship with Israel. He will fulfill all the promises he made to Abraham and his descendants. They will have a family as numerous as the stars of the sky. They will have a family home called the Promised Land. But individually, each of these foreshadows tells the gospel story, describing God's incredible plan to redeem mankind in order to build an eternal family. And here they are right here in this chart. We're going to post this chart up on our website, under our media section where these videos are. So we'll have this chart and any other chart that I had up there will be up there that you can download. Keep in mind that they are copyrighted, so you can copy them right off the website. Okay, that's what that means. But the important concept to grasp about these 7 foreshadows is that both individually and collectively, they create a beautiful picture of the redemptive and transformative gospel theme that flows through all episodes of God's story. And what I'd like to do with our time today is to help us come out of the shadows, so to speak, in order to see how the story of our faith journey, our individual faith journey, plays an important role in God's story. Every journey of faith tells a beautiful story of redemption and transformation, doesn't it? And I want to do this by describing 2 life-defining narratives that are common to everyone's journey of faith. But before I do this, I want to raise this provocative question, okay? If God's ultimate plan is to build an eternal family, then why do we first have to do this crazy thing called life? Just let that marinate in your image of God DNA for a second, all right? If God's ultimate plan is for us to be with Him in eternity, why do we have to do this? Why can't we just skip episode 1 and 2 and just go straight, pass go, collect $200, and go straight to eternity? And I want to suggest to you that the answer to this question is that there's something absolutely crucial that we must first experience in this finite life that will make us fit for eternal life. And hopefully by looking at these 2 life-defining narratives, we will gain a better understanding about why we can't just go straight into eternity. So the first life-defining narrative is what I call the life cycle journey. And the life cycle journey is about what our bodies experience between birth and death. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 and 2 says, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die." Now, did you know that once we're outside of the womb, we all begin our lives with inspiration? We breathe in, right? That's how we start our lives. And we all end our lives with expiration. We all breathe out. Okay, and I find this little breathing detail about life and death to be very fascinating. Because if you think about life as both an exciting and challenging adventure, then at birth we are inspired to begin that adventure. Okay, I'm all pumped up here. I'm ready to go. Look out, world, because here I come. But at death, the adventure expires. Kind of like how a subscription expires once you reach the expiration date. But what I find really fascinating is that in between our birth and our death, we all have to continually breathe in and breathe out, inspire and expire in order to stay alive. It's too deep for 9:40, isn't it? In other words, philosophically speaking, our lives are a mix of victory and defeat, and satisfaction and disappointment, accomplishment and failure, acquisition and loss, beauty and tragedy. And the human life cycle is just one way that we see this dichotomy in action. God could have created us as fully mature adults, but He didn't. And the physiological and the emotional adjustments that are required to transition through the various stages of life are both very exciting at times and they're very challenging at times, aren't they? As a pastor of a church that has so many families, I often get to see your babies grow into kids and then into teens, and I've been here long enough to see them even become adults. And sometimes their growth spurts are so rapid and so pronounced that I will often look at them and say, does that hurt? And in reality, yes, it literally hurts physically and emotionally to mature through the life cycle narrative. It hurts to have our teeth push through our tender gums. It hurts when we break our bones, when we catch a cold or the flu, suffer from allergies, try to beat cancer, struggle with anxiety or fear, lose our mojo as we get older, experience a stroke or a heart attack, and it hurts to cope with dementia as we try to hold on to the one thing that is so dear to us, the memories of our own story. In God's infinite wisdom, He didn't choose to create us as fully mature adults. Instead, we are born into God's story as infants. And we are forced to journey through those various stages of life as we continually inspire and expire through that journey. And when we do this, we gain and we lose and we laugh and we cry over and over and over again. And when we do this, we learn something crucial that prepares us for eternity. And maybe that's what 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 is getting at. When referring to the challenges of growing old, it says, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. In other words, our body is only a temporary housing for our soul. We can't take it with us into eternity. But as our body moves closer and closer to its expiration date, you have an expiration date, don't you? As our bodies move closer and closer to its expiration date, our soul becomes more and more inspired each day. Because part of growing old, listen to this, part of growing old is letting go of this physical world so that we can take hold of the spiritual world to come. Those of you who are more mature in this room know this. Just one by one, those fingers get pried off. Your health goes away. Mind goes away, and you realize it's got to be about something else. And in this sense, the life cycle narrative prepares us for eternity. That brings us to the second life-defining narrative. And I call this the life experience journey, and this is what our souls experience between birth and death. 1 Peter 1:7 says, speaking about grief and trials come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Messiah Yeshua is revealed. Peter has in view here the refining process of subjecting gold to intense heat in order to remove any impurities from it. And Peter is comparing what a goldsmith does to make gold pure to what God does to make our faith pure. And both have to go through the intense heat of the refiner's fire in order for that to happen. And notice that this faith refining is all in preparation for when the Messiah comes to establish his eternal kingdom forever. That's what eternal means. Which won't take place until the third and final episode of God's story. And what I love the most about this passage is that it is Peter who wrote it. Because if anyone needed to be refined more in his lifetime, it is that arrogant, condescending, know-it-all punk named Peter. And don't we all know a person of faith like this in our lives? And maybe it's us, right? Someone who has this super spiritual, holier-than-thou attitude. Someone who has all the answers for every question. Someone who sees everything as black and white, right or wrong, no gray areas in life at all. And they will give you their opinion about it, whether you ask for it or not. But in reality, their life is typically a mess, and they are some of the biggest hypocrites around. That's Peter in a nutshell. And when Jesus was talking once about suffering and dying in Matthew chapter 16:22, Peter says to Jesus, "Excuse me, can I see you for a second? Can we just go step over here a little bit," right? And so he takes Jesus over to the side, and he basically says, "What the heck are you talking about? That's not how it goes down." Now keep in mind, he's talking to God here, right? Can you believe the chutzpah of this guy? But I know some people that would correct God that way. And Jesus says back to Peter in verse 23, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God. You're just thinking like a human here." That had a sting, right? Later on in Matthew chapter 26, right around verse 33, just before Jesus is arrested, he tells his disciples that when this happens, they're all going to run away. And super spiritual Peter says, "Even if they all fall away, I never will. I'll go to my death for you." And Jesus says to Peter, "Let me tell you what's really going down here. This night, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me." Not just once, Peter, but 3 times. You'll have 3 opportunities to get this right. You're going to fail on all 3. And if your money is on Jesus being right, you win. Because sure enough, later that night, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And Luke 22:62 tells us that at that very moment, when Peter denies Jesus for the 3rd time, the rooster crows. And we are also told that at that exact moment, Peter makes eye contact with Jesus. Can you imagine? And immediately, Peter leaves the courtyard weeping bitterly. All the gospel writers tell this story, but only Dr. Luke tells us that Peter wept bitterly. And don't miss this important detail, because this is one of those life-defining, game-changing moments for Peter. He's humiliated. He's broken because he suddenly realized he is no super spiritual giant. In fact, he is a spiritual fraud. And at that moment, Peter enters into the intense heat of the refiner's fire in order to remove the impurities of his faith. Later that day, Jesus is crucified, and after he rises from the dead, 3 days later, Jesus hangs around with his disciples for 40 days. And then he ascends back to heaven. But during those 40 days, Peter has to be thinking, "I'm out. I am not fit to be a follower of Jesus. My time has expired." And so we find in John 21 that Peter has gone back to fishing. Isn't it interesting how we typically fall back to old lifestyles and old habits in the face of our failures and disappointments? Happens all too often. Peter went back to fishing, and some of the other disciples joined him, but after being out on the lake all night long, they didn't catch even one single fish. But suddenly a voice from the shoreline shouts out to them, "Try throwing your nets on the right side of the boat." And when they do, they catch so much fish that they're unable to bring their nets in. And this interaction is so similar to what happened when Peter and John first met Jesus that they now realize it's Jesus shouting to them from the shoreline. And so they make a mad dash to be with him. But that reunion has to feel really awkward for Peter, doesn't it? Because he and Jesus haven't had the "you blew it" talk yet. That opportunity comes a short time after eating some tasty fish, when Jesus finally breaks the ice and says to Peter, "Peter, hey, do you love me more than these?" Meaning the other disciples. And obviously he's referring back to that time when Peter foolishly, naively shouted out, "If everyone abandons you, I'll never abandon you. I'll go to my death for you." And so it's like Jesus saying to Peter, are you still clueless? Or have you learned something? And since Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus asked this question to Peter 3 times. And each time Peter says, "I love you," back to Jesus. But what you can't tell from the English translations is that there are 2 different Greek words that are being used for love in this dialogue. English only has 1 word for love, but the Greek language has 3. Agape is that unconditional, I will go to my death for you kind of love. Phileo is, we're good friends, but I probably won't take a bullet for you at this moment. And eros is an erotic, sexual kind of love. And this conversation bounces back and forth between the use of agape and phileo, and I inserted those words so that you can see which one is being used. And so when Jesus asked the question the first time, he says, "Do you agape? Peter, do you love me so much that you would go to your death for me?" And Peter says back, I phileo love you. I love you like a good friend. Feed my sheep. He asked him a second time, "Peter, do you agape? Will you die? Do you love me so much, so unconditionally that you will die for me?" And Peter says again, "I love you. I phileo love you. I love you like a friend." And the third time, Jesus switches it up. "Peter, do you love me like a friend? Do you phileo love me?" And Peter's a little defensive, right? You know that's how I love you. You knew it when you asked the question the first time. That's all I've got. I wish I had more. That's all I've got to give you. In other words, Peter is no longer this super spiritual, arrogant, clueless Jesus freak. He's more authentic. He's more transparent. He's more down to earth. He's more relatable. And my guess is he doesn't have an answer for everything anymore. And what I love about this conversation is that each time Peter says, "I only phileo love you" to Jesus, Jesus says back to Peter, "Awesome! I can use a guy like that. Feed my sheep." And from this time on, Peter is a changed man who does incredible things for the kingdom of God. His faith has proved to be genuine, and he is fit for eternity. That's Peter's story. But what's your story? Psalm 139:16 says, "All the days ordained for us were written in God's book before one of them came to be." God wrote a story. And in his story, it's not complete without our story. And our story is simply the redemptive and transformative work that God is doing on our journey of faith to make us fit for eternity. one more story from the Bible. In John chapter 9, there's a story of a man. He's an adult now, and he's been born blind. He's blind since birth. In Jewish thinking, not biblical thinking, but just Jewish thinking, if you've got some kind of an affliction like this, it's because somebody sinned. So they asked Jesus, who sinned? Was it his parents or was it even this guy? I don't know how you sin in the womb, but they asked the question anyways. And Jesus says back to them in in verse 3 in John chapter 9, he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But listen to this. This is what he said. This happened. This man is blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. All the days ordained for us were written in God's story before one of them came to be. Now, it happened to be the Sabbath when Jesus healed. We covered that a couple foreshadows ago, right? And so that's a no-no in rabbinic teaching. And so they kind of harassed this guy. Who was he? How dare him? He's a sinner, right? And they keep pressing it. And they press his parents, and they go back to press this guy. And I love it. In verse 25, he says, I have no idea if he's a sinner or not. He did say, how could he do this? How could a sinner do what he did to me? But I don't know. I mean, he's saying, look, I'm not going to get into a box of your theology here. There's only one thing I know. I used to be blind, and now I can see. That's my story. What's your story? Our story is simply the redemptive and transformative work that God is doing on our journey of faith to make us fit for eternity. Without your story, God's story is incomplete. You are all living testimonies. And you know how you tell your story? Just like this guy. I used to be this way, and now I'm that way. I don't know. Predestination, free will, fun stuff to talk about, but really, I used to be this way, and now I'm this way, and God did it. That's the story God wants you to tell. And I believe he inspires us to tell that story through amazing things like Foreshadows that shows that only God could move things through the entire course of history to play out exactly the way he said they would. So take a moment, just take a few moments and just think about where you're at right now on your faith journey. And we're all at various stages. I can remember a time, a little over 34 years ago now that I really didn't have any faith. I believed, but what I believed in was nothing. And I was a mess. And all I know is I used to be like that, and now I'm like this. And on the continuum, I still got a long way to go, but I've come a long way too. And we're all somewhere on that continuum. So think about that just a moment. And the music is playing. Just where are you at on that continuum? Father, just think that we can scratch the surface on why we have to do this thing called life. But what I know that is common to all of us is that we have to journey through this life cycle. We all have to journey through the life experience cycle. And part of that journey, maybe most of that journey, is for us to begin to let go of the things that we think are really important in the physical realm, that we might grab onto those things that are eternally important in the spiritual realm. And as each one of us is in a different place on the continuum, whether we need to heal from past wounds, whether we're struggling with fear and anxiety about the future or regrets from our past, things that are keeping us from moving further down the continuum, we can trust that you who began this good work in us will carry it on to completion until the day that Yeshua comes back. And that all the things that have already been scripted that enter into our life, that you allow to enter into our life, are there to remove the impurities out of our faith, that they might be proved to be genuine. And so as we think about even those two narratives, the life cycle and the life experience, may we be able to say as a congregation collectively, bless the Lord, O my soul. Thank you, God, that you care enough about us, that you love us so much. That you invite us to be with you for eternity. And it's in Yeshua's name that I pray. Amen.